My son raised his hand at me inside my own kitchen, and I didn't say a word. But the next morning, when he came downstairs thinking I'd swallowed his violence whole, he froze mid-step when he saw who was sitting at my breakfast table. Two people who had known him since he was a boy, now dressed in the quiet armor of authority. I was sitting at the head of the table, smoothing out the lace cloth my mother embroidered 40 years ago. When Langston walked into the dining room, he had that swagger about him. Loose-limbed, careless, like a man who'd finally put his mother in her place. He hadn't even noticed the bruise blooming purple on my cheek. He was so focused on himself. He grabbed a ham biscuit from the platter, took a bite, and started talking about how things were going to be different now in this house. About how he was tired of walking on eggshells, about how I needed to get with the program. But the words died in his throat when the chair beside me scraped against the hardwood. His face, which had been flushed from last night's bourbon, turned the color of ash, like he'd seen a ghost rise from the grave. The biscuit slipped from his fingers and crumbled onto the floor. He knew in that 1 second that my silence the night before hadn't been surrender. It had been a verdict. But for you to understand how we got to this breakfast that felt more like a courtroom than a Sunday meal, let me introduce myself properly. I'm Dolores Maywood. I'm 72 years old, a widow, and I live in a small river town just outside Mobile, Alabama. You know the kind. White clapboard houses, creaky porches, magnolia trees heavy with blooms in the summer. That's me. I've always been a peaceful woman. I raised my boy mostly on my own after my Eldridge passed, worked as a seamstress for nearly 50 years, so he'd never want for anything. Mended clothes, mended hearts, kept the peace. But until about 6 hours ago, I didn't know I'd been sharing my home with a storm that had my own son's face. It all happened, or maybe it all fell apart, around 2:30 in the morning. Langston came home late, real late. I was in the kitchen, sitting in my old sewing chair with a cup of chicory coffee, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and trying to calm the unease that had been sitting in my chest for months. It was a humid night, so thick you could almost chew the air. The sound that startled me was the front door slamming like a shotgun blast. He stumbled in, smelling of bourbon and something burnt, probably from punching something that couldn't punch back. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. His knuckles were split and bleeding. I stayed quiet. He kicked his boots off and left them sprawled in the hallway. I heard glass shatter, the picture frame with his daddy's photo, the one I kept on the side table. He didn't even look back. He walked into the kitchen, and when he saw me sitting there, calm and still, his anger seemed to swell up like a thundercloud. He started yelling, saying it was my fault his life had turned to nothing, that I'd convinced him to stay in this backwater town when he could have been something, that I cared more about this creaky old house and my dead husband's memory than I did about him. I stood up slowly, my knees aching, and said in the gentlest voice I could manage, "Langston, baby, go to bed. You're not yourself. We'll talk in the morning." That's all it took. That was the trigger. He came at me. A 43-year-old man, strong as his father had been, against his own mother. He grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me so hard I felt my teeth rattle. And then he shoved me. I went flying backward into the counter. The edge caught my ribs. My head snapped back against the cabinet, and I heard the dull crack of wood against bone. And it didn't stop there. He raised his hand, his own hand, the one I'd held when he was learning to walk, and he struck me across the face. The sound was sharp, ugly, the kind of sound that echoes in your soul. I tasted copper in my mouth right away. My lips split open. Blood ran warm down my chin. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stayed there, half crumpled against the counter, looking at him. And him? He just stood there for a second, breathing hard, fists still clenched. Then he huffed, turned his back, and walked away. Up the stairs, into his room, slammed the door, left his mother bleeding on the kitchen floor. The silence in the house after that was the heaviest thing I'd ever felt. You know the kind, the quiet that comes after something breaks and there's no gluing it back together. I pulled myself up slowly, using the counter for support. My ribs screamed, my head throbbed. I went to the little washroom off the hallway and turned on the light. The woman staring back at me in the mirror had a swollen lip, a bruise beginning to darken her cheek, and blood smeared at the corner of her mouth. But in that moment, looking into my own eyes, I didn't see a victim. I saw Dolores Maywood, a woman who'd survived her husband's death, raised a boy on her own, and built a life with calloused hands and a stubborn heart. I saw the woman who was done being afraid. I decided right then and there that was the last time. I went back to the kitchen, cleaned the blood from my lip with a cold cloth, and instead of going to bed to cry, I started cooking. It was the only thing I could do to keep my hands from shaking and my mind from shattering. I got out the flour, the lard, the buttermilk. I pulled down the cast iron skillet my Eldridge gave me for our second anniversary, the one I'd cooked 1,000 Sunday breakfasts in. And while the world slept and my son snored upstairs like nothing had happened, I cooked. I made ham biscuits, scrambled eggs with chives from the garden, peach butter, chicory coffee, strong and dark. With every pan I heated, every biscuit I shaped, my plan became clearer. I wasn't going to fight him with screaming. I wasn't going to beg or cry or try to reason with him. I was going to use the one language Langston seemed to have forgotten: accountability, consequence, and the law. I set the table like it was a holiday. The lace cloth, the fine china with the blue edges, fresh coffee in the silver pot, everything perfect. When the clock hit 7:30, I was ready. I'd washed my face but left the bruise uncovered, pinned my hair neat, put on a long charcoal gray dress, the one I wore to Eldridge's funeral. The smell of breakfast drifted upstairs like bait. I knew Langston would come down. I knew he'd think everything was fine, that I'd forgiven him the way mothers always do. Little did he know that forgiveness this time was coming with witnesses. Langston came down at 7:58, face puffy, eyes still bloodshot. He saw the table set and gave a crooked, arrogant smile. "See, Ma, I knew you'd come around. This is how it works. We blow off steam, then we move on." He sat down without asking, started eating like he'd earned it. Then, knock, knock, sharp, firm, final. He turned toward the door, still chewing. And when he saw Judge Lorraine Payton step into the room, her silver hair pulled back, her face carved from 50 years of verdicts. And when he saw Deputy Marshal Carter Briggs behind her, the man who'd coached him in Little League, now wearing his badge, the smirk died on his lips. His world was about to come crashing down. Now, before we continue, thank you for listening to this stage. It means a lot to me. Please kindly tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you felt this one in your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story. Also like and share, and keep walking with me through these journey of love, pain, and the quiet lessons life whispers when we least expect them. Now let's continue. The first batch of biscuits came out of the oven at 3:47 in the morning. The smell of butter and lard filled the kitchen, a smell that should have meant comfort, home, Sunday mornings after church. But in the pre-dawn hours, it was the smell of my resolve. I set the hot skillet on the stove rack. The iron made a soft tink in the quiet house. My hands, dusted with flour, looked ghostly in the dim light. I moved around the kitchen with a calm that wasn't mine. It was borrowed, an armor I'd put on over the trembling woman who'd been on the floor just hours before. And as I worked, I made 3 calls, 3 pillars, 3 witnesses, because I was done protecting a grown man from the consequences he'd built with his own fists. While the biscuits cooled on the wire rack, I sat down at the kitchen table with my coffee and let myself remember, not the man upstairs who'd struck me, but the boy he used to be, the boy my Eldridge and I raised with our whole hearts, Eldridge. Even now, 15 years after they buried him, I can still hear his laugh, deep and rolling like thunder over the river. He was the kind of man who built things with his hands and his whole soul. This house, these walls, the porch swing out front, he laid every board, drove every nail. "Dolores," he'd say, wiping sawdust from his brow, "a man's home is his promise to his family. I'm building you a promise that'll outlast me." And it did. But Lord, how I wish he hadn't been right about that. Eldridge worked at the shipyard for 32 years. Left before dawn, came home smelling of salt and diesel, hands rough as bark. But those same hands would cradle baby Langston at night, singing him old hymns in that gravelly voice until the boy's eyes fluttered shut. We didn't have much money, but we had enough. Enough for Sunday dinners, enough for Langston's school supplies, enough for love to grow in the cracks of our simple life. When Eldridge died, sudden like a light going out, Langston was only 28. A heart attack took him right there on the dock, mid-shift. The foreman said he'd just dropped his wrench, put a hand to his chest, and was gone before the ambulance arrived. I remember standing in the funeral home, numb, watching them lower my husband into the ground, while the choir from First Baptist sang, "Precious Lord, take my hand." Langston stood beside me, stone-faced, gripping my hands so tight I thought my bones might crack. He didn't cry, not in front of anyone. But that night, after everyone had gone home and the casseroles were stacked in the refrigerator, he came into the kitchen where I was washing dishes and just collapsed into my arms. He sobbed like a child. "Mama," he choked out between gasps, "I'm supposed to take care of you now. I promised Daddy I'm supposed to make him proud." And he did. For so many years, he did. I stood and walked over to the counter where my sister Amara's Christmas gift sat, one of those sleek digital photo frames with the black screen that cycled through pictures day and night. I'd loaded it with old photographs months ago, back when looking at them didn't feel like staring at evidence of something broken. As I watched, a picture appeared. Langston, maybe 7 years old, standing on the riverbank with a fishing pole nearly as tall as he was. His smile was gap-toothed and enormous, his little chest puffed out with pride. Beside him, Eldridge crouched down, one arm around the boy's shoulders, pointing at something in the water. I pressed my fingers to my lips. That was the summer Eldridge taught him to fish. Every Saturday morning, they'd wake before the sun and head down to the mobile river with a tackle box and a thermos of sweet tea. Langston would come home muddy, mosquito-bitten, and glowing. "Mama, I caught 3, he'd shout, bursting through the door. "Daddy said I'm a natural." The church ladies used to stop me after service just to tell me how polite he was, how respectful. "Dolores, that boy of yours held the door for me at the post office yesterday. You're raising him right." And I believed them. The photo frame flickered. Now it showed Langston in his Little League uniform, bright blue with white stripes, the number 12 stitched on the back. He was holding a trophy, grinning so wide his eyes nearly disappeared. Deputy Marshal Carter Briggs was standing behind him, one hand on Langston's shoulder, smiling with the kind of pride coaches have when they see something special in a kid. Carter coached that team for 5 years. He saw something in Langston, a work ethic, a hunger to be better. "Your boy's got heart, Dolores," Carter told me once after a game. "He doesn't quit. You and Eldridge are doing something right." Langston worshipped Carter back then, wanted to be just like him, strong, steady, respected. If someone had told me that one day Carter would be standing in this kitchen not as a mentor, but as a lawman coming to hold Langston accountable, I would have called them a liar. The frame changed again. Langston at 15, standing in the front pew at First Baptist, dressed in a white shirt and black slacks, holding a hymnal. His voice had just started to deepen, and Reverend Price had invited him to sing with the adult choir. I remembered sitting in the 3rd row, Eldridge beside me, both of us swelling with pride as our boy's voice rose clear and strong above the congregation. "He's got his daddy's voice," Sister Eunice whispered to me, "and his mama's heart." After church, there'd be potlucks in the fellowship hall, fried chicken, collard greens, macaroni and cheese, peach cobbler, the kind of meals that filled your belly and your soul. Langston would help the older folks carry their plates, would sit with the younger kids and make them laugh. People loved him. They saw a future in him. "That boy's going places," they'd say. "Mark my words, Langston Maywood is going to make this whole town proud." And for a long time, it looked like they were right. He graduated high school with honors, got a job at the steel plant, good pay, steady work, benefits. He bought himself a truck, helped me fix the roof after Hurricane Ivan tore shingles off like paper. He was the man Eldridge had raised him to be, dependable, strong, present. I blinked, pulling myself back to the present. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. The kitchen smelled like biscuits and memory. I looked at the photo frame one more time. It had cycled to a recent picture, maybe 2 years old. Langston standing in the backyard at a 4th of July cookout, spatula in hand, laughing at something someone said. He looked happy, but happiness, I've learned, is sometimes just a photograph, a single frozen moment that hides the rot growing underneath. Because it was right after that summer that everything started to fall apart. The steel plant announced layoffs. Langston's shift got cut. Then his hours. Then, 3 months later, the whole plant shut down. And the boy I raised, the one who fished with his daddy, who sang hymns, who held doors for church ladies, started to disappear. Slowly at first, then all at once. I stood, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and started mixing the dough for another batch of biscuits. My hands moved on their own, kneading, shaping, placing each one carefully in the skillet. Because in a few hours, the people who remembered that boy, the good boy, the promising boy, were going to sit at this table and bear witness to what he'd become. And maybe, just maybe, seeing them would remind Langston too. Remind him of who he used to be, before the anger, before the bitterness, before he raised his hand at the woman who gave him life. The oven timer dinged. I slid the skillet inside and closed the door. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, a thin gray line separating night from morning. The reckoning was coming, and I was ready. The steel plant shut down on a Tuesday in October. I remember because Langston came home that afternoon earlier than usual, his face carved from stone, holding a yellow envelope with his severance papers inside. He didn't say a word, just walked past me in the hallway, went to his room, and closed the door. I stood there with a dish towel in my hands, flour still dusted on my apron from making cornbread, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. That plant had been the spine of our town for 40 years. It employed half the men within 20 miles, welders, foremen, laborers, engineers. When it closed, it didn't just take jobs, it took futures. It took purpose. And for Langston, it took the last thing tying him to the man his father had been. The first few weeks, I tried to be gentle. "Baby, you'll find something else," I'd say, setting a plate in front of him at dinner. "You've got skills, you've got experience. Someone's going to see that." He'd nod, but his eyes were somewhere else. Distant. Dark. He started sleeping later, spending hours in his room with the door shut. Some days he wouldn't come out until past noon, and when he did, he'd shuffle into the kitchen in the same clothes he'd worn the day before, unshaven, smelling stale. "Did you put in any applications today?" I'd ask, trying to keep my voice light. "I'm working on it, Mama," he'd mutter, pouring himself coffee and disappearing again. But he wasn't working on it. He was disappearing. The borrowing started small. "Mama, can I get $60? I need to put gas in the truck for a job interview." Of course I gave it to him. What mother wouldn't? But the interview never came up again, and neither did the $60. 2 weeks later. "Mama, I need $120. The electric bill's going to be tight this month." I gave him that too, even though I'd already paid the electric bill myself. Then it was $200, then $300. Each time, he'd promised to pay me back by the end of the month. Each time, the end of the month would come and go, and he'd avoid my eyes across the dinner table. I kept a little notebook in the kitchen drawer where I used to track household expenses. I started writing down the amounts, not because I wanted the money back, but because I needed to see it. Needed proof that this was real, that my son was changing into someone I didn't recognize. By Christmas, the number had climbed past $1,500. The irritability came next. Little things would set him off, things that never used to matter. The kettle whistling too loud, a pen left on the counter, the neighbor's dog barking at supper time. "Can you do something about that damn dog?" he'd snap, slamming his fist on the table hard enough to make the silverware jump. "Langston, it's just a dog. It'll quiet down." "I said do something about it." His voice would fill the whole house, echoing off the walls like something ugly and alive, and I'd go quiet, because I didn't know what else to do. The late nights started sometime around January. He'd leave the house after dark without saying where he was going and come home past midnight, sometimes later. I'd hear his truck rumbling up the gravel drive, the engine cutting off, the door slamming. Then his boots on the porch, heavy, uneven. The smell would hit me before I even saw him. Whiskey, sharp and sour, mixed with cigarette smoke and something else I couldn't name. Defeat, maybe. Bitterness fermenting into something toxic. "You're home late," I'd say from the kitchen, where I'd be sitting with my sewing, waiting up because I couldn't sleep until I knew he was safe. "I'm grown, Mama. Don't wait up for me." And he'd stumble past, leaving muddy boot prints on the floor I'd just mopped. The small responsibilities started falling away like leaves in autumn. The leaky faucet in the bathroom I'd asked him to fix 3 times, still dripping. The loose board on the porch steps that Eldridge would have repaired in 10 minutes, still loose, waiting to trip someone. The gutters clogged with pine needles and rot, still overflowing every time it rained. "Langston, honey, when you get a chance, could you take a look at—" "Not today, Mama." "But it's been weeks. I said not today." His voice would crack like a whip, and I'd take a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't my son. This was someone else wearing his face. But the worst part, the part that ate at me like acid, was the blame. It started as little comments, tossed out like grenades during dinner, or while we sat watching the evening news. "If you hadn't convinced me to stay here after high school, I could have gone to trade school in Birmingham. Could have been something." I'd set my fork down slowly. "Baby, you said you wanted to stay close to home. You said, you made me feel guilty for wanting to leave. Don't pretend you didn't." Or, "Daddy would have known what to do. He would have had connections. But you just sit here sewing dresses for church ladies like that's going to save us." The words stung worse than any slap, because part of me wondered if he was right. The resentment grew like mold in the corners of a house you can't quite keep clean. Quietly, steadily, in the dark places you don't look at until it's too late. He started blaming me for everything, for the plant closing, for the town being too small, for him not having a father to guide him through this, for me being too old, too slow, too useless to help him fix his life. "If you'd pushed me harder, if you'd saved more money, if you hadn't raised me to be so damn loyal to a place that doesn't give a damn about me." Each accusation was a nail driven into the foundation of what we used to be. And I stayed silent. I told myself it was grief talking, that he was hurting, lost, drowning in shame and frustration, and he just needed time. I told myself that love meant absorbing the blows, that mothers were supposed to be soft places for their children to land, even when those children were 43 years old and landing like anvils. I told myself that speaking up would only make it worse, so I stayed quiet. I cooked his meals. I washed his clothes. I tiptoed around his anger like it was a sleeping beast I didn't want to wake. Mothers often mistake silence for love, but silence, I was learning, is just another word for surrender, and surrender only invites more harm. By late summer, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a place where 2 people existed in separate worlds, one shrinking, one expanding with rage. I'd catch myself holding my breath when I heard his footsteps, measuring my words, choosing my battles, or rather, choosing to have no battles at all. I didn't know it then, but I was already losing. Not to him, to my own fear of confronting the truth, that the boy I raised was gone, and the man who'd taken his place was capable of something I never thought possible. The night he raised his hand at me, I finally understood. Silence hadn't protected either of us. It had only given the darkness room to grow. And now, in the early gray light of morning, as I pulled another batch of biscuits from the oven and set the table for the reckoning to come, I knew one thing for certain. I was done being silent. 6 months after the plant closed, Langston finally found work at the port. Not the shipyard where his father had given 32 years of his life, that had downsized years ago, but the commercial port on the other side of Mobile Bay, handling freight containers and cargo manifests. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was something. "See, Mama? he said the night he got the call, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the old Langston. "Told you I'd figure it out." I smiled, relief flooding through me like warm water. "I'm proud of you, baby. Your daddy would be proud, too." He nodded, but something in his eyes flickered and went dark. I should have paid attention to that flicker. The job lasted 8 months before everything fell apart again. Restructuring, they called it. The port was modernizing, bringing in younger managers with college degrees and computer skills. Men who'd never touched a wrench or felt the weight of honest labor were suddenly making decisions about how things should run. Langston's position, solidly mid-level, earned through experience, was optimized. They didn't fire him. That would have meant severance, benefits, explanations. Instead, they demoted him, moved him to a corner desk with an outdated computer and a stack of paperwork nobody else wanted to touch, took away his crew, took away his authority, took away every shred of dignity he'd clawed back after the plant closure. When he came home that evening, he looked like a man who'd been hollowed out. "They moved me," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his work boots caked with dock mud. "Moved you where, baby?" "To a desk, filing shipping invoices." "Me, filing papers like some kid fresh out of high school." He laughed, but it wasn't a laugh. It was something sharp and bitter, like glass breaking. "Langston, it's still a job. It's still—" "My daddy worked that port for 3 decades. 3 decades, Mama. And you know what they said when I asked why they were pushing me aside? They said the port's moving in a new direction, like Daddy's legacy, like everything he built, doesn't mean a damn thing." His voice cracked on the last word. I reached for him, but he pulled away. "Don't," he said quietly. "Just don't." And he walked past me, up the stairs, and shut his door. The drinking, which had been occasional, became constant. I'd find bottles hidden in strange places, under the bathroom sink, in the garage behind the paint cans, tucked in the back of the linen closet. Cheap whiskey, mostly. The kind that came in plastic bottles with labels that peeled at the corners. At first, he'd wait until evening. Then it became afternoon. Then I started smelling it on him in the morning, seeping through his pores like poison working its way out. "Langston, you can't go to work like this." "I'm fine." "Baby, you're not fine. Let me help you." "I said I'm fine." And the conversation would end with a slammed door or the roar of his truck engine as he peeled out of the driveway, leaving me standing on the porch with my heart in my throat. The comments became sharper, more deliberate. We'd be sitting at dinner, something I still insisted on, even though most nights he barely touched his food, and he'd say things designed to cut. "Must be nice, Mama, sitting here in this house Daddy built while I'm out there getting disrespected every day." "Langston, that's not fair." "Fair? You want to talk about fair? I'm 43 years old, living in my childhood bedroom, working a job a teenager could do. But yeah, let's talk about what's fair." Or, "You know what the guys at work said today? They said, 'Langston, why don't you just retire early like your old man?' They were laughing, Mama, laughing about Daddy dying on that dock." "Baby, I'm sure they didn't mean—" "You weren't there. You don't know what it's like." His eyes would go cold and distant, and I'd feel the conversation slipping away from me like water through my fingers. The shouting started happening over nothing. A commercial on TV he didn't like. The neighbors' wind chimes making noise, me humming while I folded laundry. "Can you stop that?" "Stop what, honey?" "That humming. It's driving me crazy." "I'm sorry. I didn't realize—" "Well, realize it now." His voice would explode through the house, rattling the windows, rattling me. And I'd go quiet, folding the clothes in silence, my hands shaking just slightly. The moment I felt real fear, the kind that lives in your bones, came on a Saturday morning in July. The kitchen faucet had been dripping for weeks, a slow, steady drip that kept me awake at night. Plink, 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 like a countdown to something I couldn't name. I'd asked Langston to fix it. 3 times, maybe 4. That morning, he was sitting at the table reading the newspaper, or pretending to, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. I was at the sink washing collard greens, and the drip was driving me to distraction. Plink, plink, plink. "Langston, honey," I said, keeping my voice gentle. When you get a chance today, could you please take a look at this faucet? The dripping is—" He didn't look up. "Let it drip." "But baby, it's wasting water, and the noise." I said let it drip. Something in his tone made me stop moving. "Langston, it'll only take a few minutes. Your daddy kept a wrench in the—" That's when he snapped. He slammed the newspaper down on the table so hard the coffee cup jumped, sloshing liquid onto the wood. The sound cracked through the kitchen like a gunshot. He stood up, and for the first time in my life, my son loomed over me. Not my boy, not my Langston, a man, a big, angry man with his father's frame and a stranger's eyes. "The damn faucet!" he shouted, his voice filling every corner of the room. "You're worried about a damn faucet when my life is circling the drain? When everything I've worked for is gone? When I can't even live up to half the man Daddy was?" I took a step back. My hip hit the edge of the counter. "If Daddy were here," he continued, his voice dropping to something low and venomous, "he wouldn't have let this happen. He was a real man. He would have known what to do. But I'm stuck here with you, with your dripping faucets and your church dinners and your constant reminders that I'm failing." "Langston, I never said—" "You don't have to say it, Mama. I can see it in your face every time you look at me." He stood there, breathing hard. Hands clenched into fists at his sides. I held on to the counter, my knuckles white, my hands wet and cold from the greens. It wasn't what he said. It was his eyes. There was something in them I'd never seen before, something dark and poisonous, like he was looking at an enemy instead of the woman who'd raised him. And for the first time in my life, I felt a chill of fear toward my own son. Not fear that something might happen to him, fear of what he might do. He grabbed his keys from the counter, brushed past me so close I felt the heat of his anger, and stormed out. The front door slammed. His truck engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed as he tore out of the driveway, and I stood there in the kitchen, alone, listening to the faucet. Plink, plink, plink. Each drop marking time in a house that no longer felt safe. I didn't fix the faucet myself that day. I just stood there, staring at my reflection in the window above the sink, and I knew, the way you know a storm is coming before you see the clouds, that something terrible was building, something that would eventually break. Not the faucet, us. And I didn't know how to stop it. So I did what I'd been doing for months. I stayed silent. I cleaned up the spilled coffee. I finished washing the greens, and I pretended everything was fine. But deep down, in the part of me that still remembered how to listen to warning signs, I knew. The storm was already here. I was just waiting for it to hit. The night it happened was a humid, late August evening, the kind where the air sits on your chest like a heavy blanket and you can't quite catch your breath. Rain had been threatening all day. Dark clouds rolling in from the Gulf, thunder rumbling in the distance like a warning nobody heeded. I was in the kitchen, sitting in my old wooden chair by the table, working on the hem of Mrs. Patterson's Sunday dress. She'd asked me to take it up 2 inches, said her knees weren't what they used to be, and she kept tripping on the fabric. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional crack of thunder outside. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. I'd been holding my breath a lot lately. Langston had left that morning without saying where he was going. That had become normal. He'd disappear for hours, sometimes the whole day, and come back smelling like smoke and anger. I'd learned not to ask. Asking only made it worse. So I sat there with my needle and thread, trying to focus on the tiny, perfect stitches that had been my livelihood for 50 years, trying not to think about the fact that my son had become a stranger, trying not to wonder when, or if, I'd lost him for good. The rain started just after midnight, not a gentle rain, a hard, punishing rain that hammered the roof and turned the yard into mud. And then I heard it, the sound that made my stomach drop. The front door didn't open. It exploded. The crash was so loud I jumped, stabbing my finger with the needle. Blood welled up on my fingertip, a tiny, bright dot of red. I heard him before I saw him, heavy, uneven footsteps in the hallway, something scraping against the wall. "Langston?" I called out, my voice thin in the sudden chaos. No answer. just the sound of him stumbling, cursing under his breath. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, and my heart clenched. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, hanging half off his body. His left hand was bleeding, knuckles split and raw like he'd punched something or someone. His face was flushed, eyes glassy and unfocused. He smelled like bourbon and rain and something burnt, acrid. "Baby," I said carefully, setting down my sewing. "What happened? Are you hurt?" He didn't answer, just stood there swaying slightly, staring at me like he was trying to remember who I was. Then he turned and walked toward the hallway. I heard the crash before I could move. The ceramic vase, the tall blue one that had belonged to his grandmother, the one we kept on the hall table with dried flowers, shattered on the hardwood floor. "Langston!" I stood up, my chair scraping back. He walked back into the kitchen, glass crunching under his boots, and that's when I saw his face clearly. It wasn't my son looking at me. It was rage with skin on. "You," he said, his voice low and venomous, sitting there so calm, so peaceful, like nothing's wrong, like I'm not out there fighting for my life while you sit here playing with your needle and thread. "Langston, baby, you need to sit down. Let me look at your hand." "Don't baby me," he roared, and I flinched. "I'm not your baby. I'm a 43-year-old failure living in his dead father's house with a mother who won't let him forget it." "That's not true. I never—" "You don't have to say it." He stepped closer, and I could smell the bourbon thick on his breath. "I see it every time you look at me. Disappointment, shame, wishing Daddy was here instead of me." My throat tightened. "Langston, please. You're drunk. Let's talk about this in the morning when what? When I'm sober enough to pretend everything's fine? When I can smile and nod and keep being the failure you raised?" "I didn't raise a failure." My voice came out stronger than I felt. "I raised a good man. But right now, you need to go to bed. Sleep this off. We'll talk—" "I don't need sleep." He swept his arm across the table, and my sewing box went flying. Needles, thread, scissors, pins, everything scattered across the floor like a metal rain. The dress I'd been working on crumpled in a heap. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Langston, it's your fault," he said, his voice breaking. "All of it. If you hadn't convinced me to stay in this dead-end town, if you hadn't made me feel guilty every time I talked about leaving, if you hadn't raised me to be loyal to people and places that don't give a damn about me, maybe I'd be something. Maybe I'd be the man Daddy wanted me to be." "Your father loved you exactly as you were," I said quietly. "And so do I." Liar. The word hung in the air between us like a blade. I took a slow breath and said, as gently as I could manage, "Son, go to bed. You're not well. We'll talk in the morning." That's all it took. That was the trigger. Something in those words, maybe the gentleness, maybe the word son, snapped him in half. He came at me, fast. Before I could step back, before I could raise my hands, he was on me. He grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me so hard my teeth rattled. My head snapped back and forth, and I felt my neck crack. "Stop telling me what to do!" he screamed, his face inches from mine. "Stop acting like you have any control over anything. Langston, please!" He shoved me, hard. I went flying backward, my hips slamming into the edge of the counter. Pain exploded up my side. I tried to catch myself, but my feet couldn't find purchase on the scattered pins and thread. I crashed into the cabinet, and the back of my head cracked against the wooden door. White light burst behind my eyes. I tasted copper. And then I felt it. His hand. Across my face. The slap wasn't loud like in the movies. It was a soft, sickening sound. Flesh on flesh. A mother's cheek under her son's palm. But the pain was hot and immediate. My lips split. Blood filled my mouth, warm and metallic. I stumbled, my legs giving out, and I crumpled to the floor in a heap of fabric and broken things. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing hard. Looking down at me like he was seeing me for the first time, His hand, the one that had struck me, hung in the air, trembling. "Mama," he started, his voice cracking. But whatever he was going to say died in his throat. He turned away and walked out of the kitchen. I heard his boots on the stairs, heavy, deliberate. Then his bedroom door slammed shut. And then, silence. The kind of silence that comes after something breaks and there's no putting it back together. I stayed on the floor a long time, long enough for the rain to slow, long enough for the blood from my lip to drip onto the collar of my dress, long enough to hear his snoring start upstairs, deep, rhythmic, unbothered. He'd hit his mother, left her bleeding on the kitchen floor, and within minutes, he was asleep. I pressed my fingers to my mouth, and they came away red amam. My ribs throbbed, my head pounded, my cheek was already starting to swell, but somewhere between the pain and the shock, something inside me changed. Not broke, hardened, like iron pulled from fire and plunged into cold water. I pulled myself up slowly, using the counter for support. My legs shook, but they held. I walked to the little half bath off the hallway and turned on the light. The woman staring back at me in the mirror had a split lip, a bruise blooming purple on her cheek, and blood smeared at the corner of her mouth. But her eyes were clear. I cleaned my face with cold water, dabbed at the cut with a towel, watched the blood swirl down the drain. And I made a decision. Not with fear, not with anger, with clarity. That was the last time. The last time I would be afraid in my own home, Dao. The last time I would make excuses for him. The last time I would choose silence over truth. I walked back into the kitchen, stepping over the scattered pins and broken vase, and I started cleaning. Not because I was trying to erase what happened, but because I needed my hands to do something while my mind crafted a plan. And when the kitchen was clean, when the last needle was picked up and the blood was wiped away, I pulled out the cast iron skillet and the flour, and I started cooking. Because come morning, my son was going to learn something his father should have taught him long ago, that there are consequences for raising your hand against the woman who gave you life, and I was going to serve them to him on fine china. I stood at the bathroom sink, cold water running over my hands, and studied the woman in the mirror. Blood traced a thin line from my split lip down to my chin. The bruise on my cheek was already darkening from red to purple, spreading like spilled wine across my skin. My left eye would be swollen by morning. But it wasn't the injuries I was looking at. It was my eyes. They were different now, harder, clear as creek water after a storm has passed. For months, maybe years, I'd been looking at myself through a fog of excuses and hope, telling myself that Langston was just hurting, just lost, just needing time. But the fog was gone now, and what I saw was a woman who'd let fear dress itself up as love, who'd mistaken silence for peace, who'd been so busy protecting her son from consequences that she'd forgotten to protect herself from harm. I dabbed at my lip with a clean washcloth. The water in the sink turned pink, then clear again as I rinsed it. Above me, I could hear him snoring, deep, even breaths of a man sleeping off his rage, like it was nothing more than a hard day's work. He'd struck his mother and gone to bed, and that, more than the violence itself, told me everything I needed to know. I turned off the faucet, folded the washcloth neatly on the towel rack, and walked back to the kitchen. The room still smelled like his bourbon and my fear. I opened the windows, let the rain-cleaned air sweep through. Then I went to the cabinet and pulled down my mother's old flower tin, the blue one with the hand-painted roses she'd bought at a church auction in 1963. I was going to bake, not because I was hungry, not because morning required breakfast, but because my hands needed purpose, and my heart needed a ritual to keep it from shattering completely. The first batch went into the oven at 3:47 in the morning. I worked slowly, methodically, measuring the flour, cutting in the lard, adding just enough buttermilk to bring the dough together without making it sticky. These were my mother's biscuits, the recipe she'd taught me when I was 9 years old, standing on a wooden stool beside her at this very counter. "A biscuit is a promise, Dolores," she used to say. You handle it gentle, don't overwork it, and it'll rise up light and beautiful. But you get rough with it, and it turns hard and heavy, just like people. My hands moved on their own, folding, shaping, placing each biscuit in the cast-iron skillet Eldridge gave me for our second anniversary. The one I'd cooked 1,000 Sunday breakfasts in. The one that had fed my family through joy and grief and every ordinary day between. Now it would serve justice. I slid the skillet into the oven and set the timer. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and let myself look at the digital photo frame on the counter. The screen glowed softly in the pre-dawn darkness, cycling through images I'd loaded months ago when the world still made sense. A picture appeared. Langston at 7, standing knee-deep in the Mobile River, holding up a catfish almost as big as his torso. His gap-toothed grin stretched ear to ear. Beside him, Eldridge crouched in the water, one proud hand on the boy's shoulder, both of them soaked and laughing. That was the summer Eldridge taught him patience. "Fishing ain't about catching, son," he'd said. "It's about learning to wait for what matters, learning to be still." My throat tightened. The frame flickered. Now it showed Langston at his high school graduation, cap and gown, holding his diploma like a trophy. His eyes were bright with possibility. The whole world stretched out before him like an open road. Behind him in the photo, I stood beaming, my hand over my heart. Eldridge had his arm around my waist, tears streaming down his proud face. "That's our boy," he'd whispered to me that day. "We done good, Dolores. We done real good." I pressed my fingertips to my lips. The image changed again. Langston at 35, standing in our backyard at a 4th of July cookout, spatula in hand, apron tied around his waist. He was laughing at something Carter Briggs had said, his whole face open and warm. Smoke from the grill rose behind him like a halo. That was before the plant closed. Before the bitterness took root. Before he started drowning in anger and alcohol. He'd been happy then. Whole. The timer chimed softly. I stood and pulled the first batch of biscuits from the oven. They were perfect. Golden brown, risen high, the tops cracked just right. I set them on the cooling rack and started another batch, and another, and another. With each pan I filled, with each batch I baked, my plan crystallized. I wasn't going to yell, wasn't going to cry, wasn't going to pack his bags and put them on the porch. I was going to give him one last breakfast at this table, and he was going to eat it in front of witnesses. The photo frame cycled again. Langston at 15 in his church clothes, singing in the choir. His voice had been so pure then, rising above the congregation like something holy. "That boy's got a gift from God," Sister Eunice had whispered to me. "You watch. He's going to do great things." I turned away from the frame before the next image could appear. I couldn't bear to see any more ghosts of the son I'd lost. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. A thin gray line separated the darkness from dawn. I set the table with my mother's lace cloth, pulled down the fine china with the blue edges, the set we only used for Christmas and Easter. I arranged the biscuits on a serving platter, made scrambled eggs with chives from the garden, set out the peach butter I'd canned last summer, poured fresh coffee into the silver pot. Everything perfect. Everything final. When the clock struck 6, I went to my bedroom and changed out of my blood-stained house dress. I put on the long charcoal gray dress I'd worn to Eldridge's funeral, pinned my hair back neat, left the bruise on my face uncovered. It needed to be seen. Then I sat down at the head of the table and made 3 phone calls. 3 pillars who'd known Langston since he was a boy. 3 people who would bear witness to what he'd become. And when I hung up the phone after the last call, I folded my hands in my lap and waited for my son to come downstairs. The reckoning was almost here, and I was ready. The kitchen clock read 6:15 a.m. when I picked up the phone. My hands were steady now. The trembling from hours ago had been baked out of me, kneaded into dough, shaped into something with purpose. I dialed the first number from memory. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, crisp, alert, despite the early hour. "Lorraine Payton speaking." "Lorraine," I said quietly. "It's Dolores." There was a pause. In that silence, I could hear her shifting from sleep to sharp attention. Lorraine had been a circuit court judge for 28 years before she retired. She knew the weight of a phone call at dawn. "Dolores, what's wrong?" I took a breath. "I need you to come to my house this morning, 8 o'clock. And I need you to come as Judge Peyton, not just as my friend." Another pause, longer this time. "Tell me what happened." So I did. I told her about the months of unraveling, the drinking, the borrowed money that never came back, the anger that had been building like pressure in a sealed jar. And then I told her about last night. The words came out flat, factual. The shove, the crack of my head against the cabinet, the slap, the blood. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. When Lorraine finally spoke, her voice was made of iron and ice. "Did you call the police?" "No," I said, "not yet. That's why I need you there. I need witnesses who knew him before, who remember who he was supposed to be." "Dolores." "Please, Lorraine, I'm not asking you to judge my son. I'm asking you to help him see what he's become." I heard her exhale slowly. When she spoke again, her voice had softened just slightly, but the steel underneath remained. "I'll be there at 8. And Dolores, leave that bruise visible. The truth needs to be seen." "I will." "Are you safe right now?" "He's asleep. He doesn't even remember what he did." "That," Lorraine said quietly, "is the most dangerous part." We hung up. I stood there for a moment, the phone still warm in my hand, and felt something shift inside my chest. The first pillar was in place. The second call was harder. Carter Briggs had coached Langston's Little League team for 5 years. He'd been at our house for birthday parties, barbecues, Easter dinners. He'd watched my boy grow from a shy 7-year-old into a confident young man. And now I was about to ask him to come to my home as a lawman. The phone rang 4 times. When he answered, his voice was thick with sleep. "Briggs." "Carter, it's Dolores Maywood." I heard rustling, the sound of him sitting up. "Dolores, everything okay?" "No," I said simply. "It's not." I told him what I'd told Lorraine, but with Carter, I added something else. "You knew him when he was good, Carter, when he had promise. You saw something in him that made you believe." "I still believe in him, Dolores." "Then come help him remember who he used to be. Because the man who hit me last night, that's not Langston, that's someone else, and if somebody doesn't stop him now, he's going to disappear completely." Carter was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "What time do you need me there?" 8 o'clock. "And Carter, wear your badge." He understood immediately what I was asking. Not an arrest, not yet, but authority, consequence. The visible reminder that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. "I'll be there," he said. "And Dolores, I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry." "Don't be sorry," I said. "Just come." The third call went to voicemail. "Amara," I said after the beep. "It's me. I need you to come home. Something's happened with Langston. I'm okay, but I need you here. Please, come as soon as you can." I hung up before my voice could crack. My sister lived 2 hours away in Montgomery. She'd be here by mid-morning if she left right away. And knowing Amara, fierce, protective Amara, who'd threatened to fight a boy in 5th grade for calling me names, she'd probably break every speed limit getting here. I set the phone down and looked at the clock. 6:47 a.m., just over an hour until they arrived. Time to set the stage. I moved through the dining room like I was preparing for a sacred ritual, because in a way, I was. The lace tablecloth came out first, the one my mother had embroidered by hand 40 years ago, white linen with delicate blue flowers stitched along the edges. I'd only used it for weddings, christenings, funerals, and now this. I smoothed it across the table, my fingers tracing the familiar patterns. Next came the china, the good china with the blue-rimmed edges that had belonged to Eldridge's grandmother. Each plate placed with care, each fork and knife aligned just so. The crystal water glasses, the silver coffee pot that had been a wedding gift, everything gleaming, everything deliberate. This was not a meal. This was a reckoning served on heirloom porcelain. I arranged the biscuits on the best serving platter, golden, perfect, still warm. Set out the peach butter in a cut glass bowl, the scrambled eggs in a covered dish to keep them warm. Every detail mattered. Every choice was intentional. Because I needed Langston to see that this wasn't casual. This wasn't forgiveness served with a side of grits. This was justice dressed in Sunday clothes. When the table was set, I went upstairs to change. My bedroom felt different in the early morning light. Quieter, heavier with memory. I opened my closet and reached for the charcoal gray dress, the one I'd worn to Eldridge's funeral 15 years ago, the one I swore I'd never wear again because it carried too much grief. But it was the right choice now. Somber, dignified, final. I dressed slowly, my ribs aching where they'd hit the counter, pinned my hair back in a neat bun. No makeup except a touch of powder, nothing to hide the bruise that had spread across my cheek like spilled ink. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time. The woman staring back looked older than she had yesterday, but she also looked stronger. Ready. I walked back downstairs just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the kitchen window. The smell of coffee and biscuits filled the house, a smell that should have meant comfort and home. But today, it smelled like courage, like a mother who had finally chosen truth over peace. Outside, I heard the first car pulling up the gravel drive, 7:58, right on time. I smoothed my dress, touched my fingers to the bruise on my cheek, and walked to the front door. The reckoning had arrived, and I was ready to serve it. I heard him before I saw him. The creak of bed springs, the heavy thud of feet hitting the floor, the bathroom door opening and closing, water running, and then footsteps on the stairs, slow, unhurried, almost casual, like nothing had happened, like last night had been erased by sleep and bourbon sweat. I stood at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of my chair, and waited. Judge Lorraine Payton sat to my right, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, reading glasses perched on her nose as she pretended to examine the morning paper. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, professional, authoritative, deliberate. Deputy Marshal Carter Briggs sat to my left, his badge catching the morning light. His face was carved from stone, but I could see the muscle working in his jaw. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, perfectly still. Both of them had arrived at exactly 8 o'clock. Both of them had seen my face and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the bruise didn't already scream. Now we waited. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. I could picture him standing there, probably scratching his head, wondering why the house smelled like Sunday breakfast on a Thursday morning. Then he appeared in the doorway. Langston, my son, the man who'd struck me less than 6 hours ago. He was wearing the same jeans from last night, wrinkled and stained, but he'd thrown on a fresh t-shirt. His hair stuck up at odd angles. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with dark circles. But it was his expression that made my stomach turn. He was smiling, not a warm smile, not a sheepish, apologetic smile, a smug, satisfied smile, the smile of a man who thought he'd won something. He walked into the dining room with that loose-limbed swagger, shoulders back, chin up, moving like he owned every inch of space he occupied, like he'd finally established dominance in his own home. He hadn't even looked at me yet, hadn't noticed the bruise blooming purple and ugly across my cheek. He was too busy admiring the table. "Well, well," he said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Look at this. Mama went all out this morning." He reached for the platter of biscuits, grabbed one without asking, and took a large bite. Crumbs fell onto the lace tablecloth. "See, Ma," he said, around the mouthful of food. "I knew you'd come around. This is how it works in the real world. People blow off steam, things get said, and then we move on. No need to hold grudges." He sat down in his usual chair without invitation, sprawling back like a king claiming his throne. "We're going to make some changes around here," he continued, grabbing another biscuit. "New rules. First off, I'm tired of walking on eggshells in my own house. Tired of you questioning every move I make. This is my home too. Hell, it was my daddy's house before it was yours." I stood perfectly still, my hands gripping the back of my chair so hard my knuckles turned white. He still hadn't looked directly at me. "And another thing," he said, reaching for the coffee pot. "I need you to get with the program. I'm 43 years old. I don't need you hovering over me like I'm some kid who can't take care of himself. You want to help? Give me some space. Give me some respect." He poured coffee, the liquid splashing slightly over the rim of the cup. "Things are going to be different now," he said, his voice taking on an edge of satisfaction. "You're going to see. Once you stop trying to control everything, once you let me be the man of this house." That's when the knock came, sharp, firm, final. 3 deliberate raps on the front door that echoed through the house like a judge's gavel striking wood. Langston froze mid-sentence, his cup halfway to his mouth. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, then to me, then back toward the sound. "Who's that?" he asked, his swagger faltering slightly. "You expecting somebody?" I didn't answer. I simply walked to the front door and opened it. 2 uniformed deputies stood on my porch, their expressions professionally neutral. Behind them, a patrol car sat in my driveway, its presence quiet but unmistakable. "Ma'am," the first deputy said with a respectful nod, "Judge Peyton asked us to be present." "Thank you for coming," I said quietly. "Please wait here." I left the door open, deliberately, purposefully open, so that the uniforms were visible from the dining room, so that authority had a face, so that my son could see that this was not a private family matter anymore. Then I walked back to the table. Langston was standing now, his chair pushed back, his face confused and beginning to pale. "Mama, what's going on? Who's at the door?" I didn't answer. Instead, I sat down at the head of the table, and that's when the chair beside me scraped against the hardwood floor. Judge Lorraine Peyton set down her newspaper and removed her reading glasses. She looked up at Langston with the same expression she'd probably worn for 3 decades on the bench, calm, measured, and absolutely unyielding. "Good morning, Langston," she said quietly. The color drained from his face like water from a broken glass. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then Carter Briggs shifted in his seat, and Langston's eyes snapped to him. Carter, who'd taught him how to throw a curveball. Carter, who'd cheered for him at every game. Carter, who was now sitting at this breakfast table wearing a deputy marshal's badge and an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "Son," Carter said, his voice heavy as lead. The biscuit slipped from Langston's fingers. It hit the edge of the table, broke apart, and crumbled onto the floor in a scatter of golden pieces. His face, which had been flushed with bourbon confidence just moments ago, turned the color of ash, like he'd seen ghosts rise from their graves and take seats at his mother's table. His eyes finally found mine, and that's when he saw it. The bruise, purple and ugly and impossible to miss in the morning light. The split lip, the way I was holding myself, careful, guarded, like something inside me had broken and been badly mended. Understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. His hand, the one that had been holding the biscuit, began to tremble. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mama, I—" "Sit down, Langston," Judge Peyton said. Not loudly, not harshly, but with the kind of authority that made grown men obey without question. He sat, heavily, like his legs had given out beneath him. The swagger was gone. The arrogance had evaporated. What remained was a 43-year-old man suddenly realizing that his mother's silence last night hadn't been surrender. It had been a verdict. Judge Peyton folded her hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "Langston Maywood," she said, her voice filling the room. "Do you know why we're here?" He couldn't speak. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and desperate, looking for something, forgiveness maybe, or escape. But I held his gaze, steady, unflinching, done. The dining room that had been filled with the warm smell of breakfast and coffee now felt cold, formal, not a home, a courtroom. and my son was finally going to face what he'd done. Judge Lorraine Payton let the silence stretch. It was a technique I'd seen her use in court years ago when Eldridge and I had been called for jury duty. She'd let a question hang in the air until the weight of it became unbearable, until the person on the stand had no choice but to fill the void with truth. She was using it now. Langston sat frozen in his chair, his eyes darting between the three of us like a trapped animal searching for an exit that didn't exist. Finally, Judge Payton spoke. "Langston Maywood, I've known you since you were 8 years old. I watched you grow up in this town. I sat in the third pew at First Baptist and heard you sing in the choir. I saw you graduate high school. I shook your father's hand at your graduation party and told him he should be proud." She paused, removing her glasses and setting them carefully on the table. "So I want you to understand that what I'm about to say comes from someone who remembers the boy you were, not from a stranger, not from someone who wants to see you fail." Langston's throat worked, but no sound came out. "Last night," Judge Payton continued, her voice steady and cold as winter steel, "you committed domestic violence against your mother. You grabbed her. You shoved her into a counter. You struck her across the face hard enough to split her lip and leave a bruise that will take weeks to heal." "Judge Payton, Langston started, his voice cracking. "I'm not finished." The words were quiet, but absolute. "You then walked away from her while she was bleeding on the floor and went to bed. Like it was nothing. Like she was nothing." Tears were streaming down Langston's face now. "Do you understand what you've become?" Judge Payton leaned forward. "You've become the kind of man who hurts the person who loves him most. The kind of man who blames everyone else for his failures. The kind of man who uses his size and his anger as weapons against a 72-year-old woman who spent her entire life sacrificing for him." "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Judge Payton's voice cracked like a whip. "You meant every bit of it. Maybe not when you were sober, maybe not when you were thinking clearly, but you meant it when your fists were clenched and your mother was on the floor. That's when your true intentions showed." Langston's shoulders shook. He pressed his hands over his face. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "God, Mama, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize to me," Judge Payton said. "I'm not the one bleeding. But before you apologize to her, you need to hear from someone else." She nodded to Carter. Carter Briggs hadn't moved since Langston sat down. He'd been watching, steady, silent, his face unreadable. Now he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Langston," he said quietly, "do you remember the summer you hit your first home run?" The question seemed to catch Langston off guard. He lowered his hands slightly, his red-rimmed eyes confused. "You were 9 years old," Carter continued. "Bottom of the 6th inning. We were down by 2 runs. I put you up to bat even though you'd struck out 3 times that game. You know why?" Langston shook his head. "Because I saw something in you that day. Determination. Heart. The kind of grit that can't be taught. And you proved me right. You hit that ball clean over the fence, brought in 3 runs, won us the game." Carter's voice grew harder. "After the game, you ran straight to your mama and your daddy in the stands. You were so proud. And your daddy, God rest him, he picked you up and swung you around like you'd just won the World Series. You remember what he said to you?" Langston's voice was barely a whisper. He said I made him proud." "That's right. And do you know what would make him feel right now? Seeing what you did to his wife? Seeing his son, the boy he raised to be strong and good, use that strength to hurt the woman he loved?" Langston crumpled forward, his head in his hands, his whole body shaking with sobs. "I don't know what happened to you," Carter said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know where the boy I coached went, but I know this. Your father didn't raise you to be this, and your mama deserves better than what you've become." Carter stood up, and the scrape of his chair against the floor sounded like a door closing. I'm not here as your friend today, Langston. I'm here as an officer of the law, and as someone who cared about you enough to tell you the truth. You've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed, and what happens next is entirely up to you." He stepped back from the table, his hand resting on his belt near his badge. The message was clear. Authority, consequence, the law. The silence that followed was broken only by Langston's ragged breathing. Judge Peyton looked at me. "Dolores, do you have anything you'd like to say?" I'd been sitting quietly through it all, my hands folded in my lap, watching my son fall apart. Part of me wanted to reach for him, to comfort him like I'd done 1,000 times before. But the woman in the mirror this morning had been clear about one thing: silence was over. I stood slowly, my ribs protesting, and walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of Langston. He looked up at me, his face wet with tears and snot and shame. "Mama?" I held up one hand, and he fell silent. "Langston," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, "I raised a son, a good son, a son who knew right from wrong, a son who his father would have been proud of." I paused, letting the words settle. But the man sitting in this chair? The man who raised his hand at the woman who carried him, who fed him, who sacrificed everything so he could have a life? That's not my son. That's someone else. Someone I don't recognize. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Mama. Please." Sorry isn't enough. My voice didn't rise, but it cut through his pleading like a blade. Sorry is what you say when you forget a birthday or break a dish. Sorry doesn't cover what you did to me last night. I knelt down, slowly, painfully, until I was at eye level with him. "I love you, Langston. I will always love you. But love doesn't mean I have to accept being hurt. Love doesn't mean I protect you from the consequences of your choices." I reached out and placed my hand over his, the hand that had struck me. "So now I'm giving you the choice I should have given you a long time ago, the choice to be honest about what you've become and get the help you need, or face the consequences you've earned." I stood back up, my knees protesting. "Judge Peyton has already drafted the paperwork. Carter has the authority to take you into custody right now, and those 2 deputies outside, they're waiting for my word." Langston's eyes went wide. "But," I continued, my voice softening just slightly, "there's another option, a program, court-mandated counseling, substance abuse treatment, accountability, a path back to the man you're supposed to be." I stepped back to the head of the table. "The choice is yours, Langston. Help or handcuffs. Rehab or a record. The mother who raised you is offering you one last chance to save yourself." I sat down and folded my hands in front of me. "But understand this clearly. If you choose to walk away, if you refuse help, if you ever, ever raise your hand to me or anyone else again, I will not hesitate. I will press charges. I will testify. And I will watch you face every consequence the law allows." The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Langston sat there, broken and trembling, staring at the ruins of the life he'd built with his own fists. Judge Peyton slid a folder across the table toward him. "These are your options," she said quietly. "Read them. Think carefully, and then decide what kind of man you're going to be." Langston's hand shook as he reached for the folder. He opened it. Inside were 2 paths laid out in black and white. One led to redemption, the other to ruin, and for the first time in years, the choice was entirely his. I sat at the head of my mother's table, the lace cloth smooth beneath my hands, the smell of biscuits and coffee filling the air, and I waited, not as a victim, not as an enabler, but as a mother who had finally chosen truth over peace. The breakfast table, the place where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where Eldridge had said grace over Sunday dinners, where Langston had done his homework as a boy, had become something else entirely. Not a symbol of reconciliation, but a courtroom where justice was served on fine china. And whatever my son chose next would determine whether the boy I raised could ever find his way back home.